On August 14, 2009, a team of amateur climbers navigating the jagged serrations of the North Cascades stopped to clear a path through a glacial moraine and found a weathered leather notebook wedged between two slabs of granite. It was dry, it was perfectly preserved. It sat in a location that had been scoured by search teams and battered by 6 years of alpine winters, yet it looked as though it had been placed there moments ago. This is the impossible discovery that reopened a wound the mountaineering community had tried to stitch shut. In 2003, Elias Thorne did not just disappear, he evaporated. Elias was not a novice, he was an expert victim. He was a lead guide with over 200 successful summits of this specific range. He knew the pressure gradients of the Pacific Northwest better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He carried a satellite phone, a personal locator beacon, and a redundant GPS system. He was a man defined by his preparedness. On the morning of September the 12th, 2003, Elias checked out of the ranger station at 5:15 a.m. The air was a crisp 42 degrees. The barometric pressure was holding steady. He told the ranger, "The granite is thirsty today," a local colloquialism for high-grip climbing conditions. He was expected back by sunset. At 10 a.m., his GPS pinged at the base of the Forbidden Peak. At 11:30 a.m., it pinged again near the ridgeline. At 1:44 p.m., the signal stopped. No emergency trigger, no distress call, just a sudden violent silence. For 6 years, the mountains kept their secrets. The official report cited a probable crevasse fall, though no evidence of a slide was ever found. Then came the notebook. Inside, the final page contained a hand-drawn map of a route that shouldn't exist, a path leading directly into a vertical face of rock with no holds and no summit. Underneath the drawing, written in a hand that remained remarkably steady despite the altitude, were the words, "I have been invited inside." To understand the gravity of this discovery, one must understand the man who left it. Elias Thorne was a literalist. He was a man of metadata and hard physics. He did not believe in the mysticism of the peaks. He believed in the tensile strength of nylon rope and the reliable friction of rubber against stone. His disappearance left a void that was analytical as much as it was emotional. When investigators first looked at his gear list from that morning, the irony was devastating. He had 3 days of emergency rations, 2 space blankets, and a flare gun. He was prepared for every contingency except the one that took him. The search in 2003 had been the largest in the state's history. Thermal imaging drones, then in their infancy, hovered over the snowfields like mechanical vultures. Ground teams moved in a grid so tight they could see the beetles in the moss. They found nothing. No scrap of blue Gore-Tex. No shattered carbon fiber pole. The mountains are vast, but they are also loud. A fall leaves a scar. There was no scar. Imagine you are standing on that same ridgeline today, looking at the spot where the notebook was found. The wind here is a constant, mournful weight. You are looking at a piece of evidence that defies the laws of forensic decay. How does paper survive 6 years of snowmelt and sun bleaching? Why was the ink not faded? The grieving investigator doesn't look for ghosts. They look for the logic in the madness. They look at the GPS drift from that final afternoon and realize the pings weren't disappearing, they were accelerating. In the final 4 minutes of recorded data, Elias Thorne appeared to be moving at 60 miles per hour upward, not falling, ascending. The reconstruction of the narrative truth begins with the mundane items listed in the 2009 discovery log. Item 4, 1 standard issue climbing carabiner, locked. Item 5, 1 pair of polarized sunglasses, folded. Item 6, the notebook. These items were found in a neat pile as if Elias had sat down, undressed his utility, and stepped out of his life. The investigators who obsess over the evidence years later note that there was no biological material on the granite, no hair, no skin cells, no scent for the dogs. It was as if the physical body had been filtered out of the environment. At 2:10 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, a weather station 3 miles away recorded a localized seismic event, a micro tremor that lasted only 3 seconds. It was dismissed at the time as a settling glacier. Now, looking at the notebook's final drawing, that tremor takes on a different shape. The route Elias drew follows the exact fault line of that tremor. He wasn't drawing a path over the mountain, he was drawing a path through it. Why would a man of his expertise follow a crack in the earth into the dark? The mountains don't explain why. They provide the evidence and leave the interpretation to those left behind in the cold. We are forced to look at the macro shots of the notebook's spine, seeing the rust on the staples, and wonder if the time Elias spent away was the same time we spent waiting. In the forensic image of the final page, there is a smudge near the thumbprint. It isn't dirt, it isn't blood. It is a crystalline residue that matches no known mineral in the North Cascades. It is a substance that only exists in the high-pressure environment of the mantle, miles below the crust. This is where the slow burn of the mystery turns into the heat of the impossible. We track his movements through the metadata of his life, but the metadata of his death is written in a language we haven't learned to speak. At 5 p.m. on that 2009 afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the climbers who found the notebook reported a sudden, overwhelming sense of being watched. Not by a predator, but by the terrain itself. They felt the thirsty granite beneath their boots. They described the sound of the wind shifting into a frequency that felt like a hum, a vibration that matched the steady pulse of a heart. They left the notebook at the ranger station and refused to go back up. They are the proxies for our own fear. They saw the evidence and realized that being prepared is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe in the wild. Elias Thorne was the most prepared man in the valley, and his expertise only served to document his own departure. The evidence log continues to grow as modern technology is applied to the old files. We use LiDAR to strip away the trees and the snow, looking for the silhouette of a man who became a shadow. We find nothing but the geometry of the rock. The mountains keep their secrets, but they occasionally leave a breadcrumb to remind us of our own fragility. Imagine the moment the light changed for Elias. Imagine the silence that replaced the sound of his own breathing. He was a chronicler of the heights who found a depth he couldn't measure. The notebook is now held in an evidence locker, a sterile environment for a piece of history that refuses to be sterile. It smells of ozone and old snow. Every time a researcher opens it to the final page, they are struck by the same rhythmic certainty of the lines. There is no hesitation in the sketch. There is no fear. There is only the clinical observation of a guide who has found the ultimate route. He didn't lose his way. He found a new one. This is the reconstruction of a tragedy that refuses to end. We look at the timestamp of the discovery and realize it matches the exact minute of his last GPS ping, 6 years to the day. The probability of such a coincidence is mathematically negligible. It is a signal. It is a deliberate echo from the void. We are the investigators, and we are grieving not just for the man, but for the certainty we lost when he vanished. We obsess over the granular details, the way the leather was scuffed, the specific ink of the pen, because if we can find a flaw in the evidence, we can pretend the world makes sense. But the evidence is perfect. The tragedy is absolute. The mountains don't explain why he went inside. They only show us where he left his tools behind. We are left staring at a map of a wall, wondering if the invitation is still open. At 6 p.m. every year on the anniversary of the discovery, the local rangers observe a moment of silence. It isn't just out of respect. It is a lingering ancestral fear. They know that the North Cascades are not just a collection of rocks and ice. They are a living, breathing architecture that occasionally requires a tenant. Elias Thorne, the expert, the guide, the man of iron logic, was chosen. His final route remains unclimbed. His body remains unrecovered. Only the notebook remains sitting in the fluorescent light of a government building, a silent witness to a truth that defies the forensic mind. No signal, no trace, just the mountain and the secrets it chooses to share. The reconstruction is incomplete because the story hasn't finished being told by the earth itself. Every time a new hiker finds a weathered object, we hold our breath, waiting for the next page to be delivered from the stone. The mountains keep their secrets, and we keep our vigil. Why would he go? The answer is hidden in the metadata of the silence. The forensic analysis of the leather notebook, conducted in the winter of 2010 at a state lab in Olympia, revealed a series of anomalies that transitioned the case from a missing persons investigation into a study of the physically impossible. Item 6A, the binding. While the leather appeared weathered, the internal fibers of the binding showed zero cellular degradation. Under a scanning electron microscope, the paper fibers lacked the typical fracturing caused by the expansion and contraction of ice crystals. For 6 years, this object should have been subjected to over 72 freeze-thaw cycles. It should have been a pulp of gray organic matter. Instead, the cellulose remained rigid, almost pressurized. The lead forensic document examiner, a woman who had spent 20 years analyzing forged wills and blood-spattered journals, noted in her official statement, "The object does not exhibit the characteristics of a discarded item. It exhibits the characteristics of a preserved one." This is the core of the atmospheric mystery. The mountain did not merely hide the notebook, it protected it. The grieving investigator, now looking back at the thermal imaging data from the 2003 search, began to notice the ghost heat. In the sector labeled 4G, the area surrounding the Forbidden Peak, there were transient spikes in temperature, pulses that lasted for less than a second. At the time, they were dismissed as sensor noise or reflections from the granite's high quartz content. But when overlaid with the map found in the notebook, these heat spikes aligned perfectly with the imaginary route Elias Thorne had sketched. At 2:14 p.m. on the day of his disappearance, the sensors recorded a temperature jump from 38 degrees to 114 degrees in a localized pocket no larger than a human doorway. Then the cold returned. There was no smoke, no fire, just a sudden, violent displacement of thermal energy. Imagine you are Elias Thorne. You are a man who prides himself on the cold, hard reality of the alpine environment. You see the air shimmer. You feel a heat that shouldn't exist in the shadow of a glacier, and instead of turning back, you reach out. The rule of irony dictates that Elias's curiosity, the very trait that made him a world-class scout, was the mechanism of his undoing. He was too capable to be afraid of a mystery. At 3:45 p.m., the atmospheric pressure in the valley dropped by 10 millibars in a single minute, a phenomenon usually reserved for the eye of a hurricane. Down in the town of Marblemount, residents reported the birds went silent. In the logbook of a local fishing guide, the entry for that day reads, "The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The water in the river stopped moving for a count of 10. Something heavy is in the air." This mundane observation from miles away grounds the impossible event in a shared reality. Elias was not alone in experiencing the shift. He was simply the only one standing at the epicenter. The reconstruction of the narrative truth now moves to the physical evidence found alongside the notebook in 2009. Item 7, a wrist chronograph, the glass face shattered from the inside out. The hands of the watch were frozen at 1:44 p.m., the exact moment the GPS signal died. But the internal gears were not crushed. They were fused together by an electrical discharge of immense magnitude. To fuse steel gears in such a manner would require a direct strike of lightning, yet the weather reports for September 12, 2003, show a clear sky with 0 cloud-to-ground strikes. The mountains don't explain why the laws of physics seem to bend around their peaks. They only offer the shattered watch as a receipt for a soul. The evidence log becomes a haunting inventory of a life interrupted. A half-eaten protein bar, the wrapper neatly folded. A small vial of magnesium carbonate, climbing chalk, that, when tested, showed a purity level of 99.9%, far higher than any commercial brand Elias purchased. It was as if the materials he carried were being refined by the environment itself. Why would he fold the wrapper? Why would a man in the middle of a vanishing act maintain the habits of a disciplined hiker? The answer suggests that Elias didn't think he was dying. He thought he was transitioning. He was the expert victim, meticulously documenting his own departure into a realm that required his silence. We look at the macro shots of the shattered watch face and see the reflection of a world that doesn't fit our own. The open loop question haunts every forensic analyst who touches the Thorne file. If Elias Thorne is dead, where is the decay? If he is alive, where is the breath? The 2009 climbers who found the pile of gear were interviewed 3 separate times. Each time their story grew more focused on the silence. They didn't hear the wind. They didn't hear their own footsteps. They described a zone of exclusion where sound seemed to be absorbed by the rock. This matches the acoustic data from the 1998 skyquake events in the same range. The mountains keep their secrets in the frequencies we cannot hear. We are forced to listen to the echoes of a man who was last seen walking into a vertical wall. At 8:22 p.m. on the night of the disappearance, Elias's wife received a single text message from his satellite phone. It contained no words. It was a string of 14 digits, 48.5147 degrees north, 121.0583 degrees west. When search teams reached those coordinates, they found nothing but a sheer cliff of polished diorite. There were no ledges, there were no cracks, there was nowhere for a human to stand. Yet the GPS metadata confirmed the phone was at that exact location when the message was sent. It was as if he were broadcasting from inside the stone. Imagine the terror of receiving that message, knowing your husband is standing where gravity says he cannot. The grieving investigator looks at these coordinates today and realizes they form the exact center of the map Elias drew in his notebook 6 years later. The timeline is a loop. The disappearance in 2003 was the end for the family, but for Elias it was the beginning of the journey that ended in the 2009 discovery. He was placing the notebook for us to find, moving through the rock like a needle through silk. The technical term is spatial displacement, but the storytellers call it a haunting. We see the flashbulb transitions of the crime scene photos, the gear laid out on the granite like a ritual offering. The contrast between the high-tech equipment and the ancient indifferent stone is a visual echo of our own insignificance. We build tools to measure the world, but the world has its own measurements. At 10 a.m. on the third day of the 2003 search, a canine unit followed a scent trail that led directly to the cliff face at the coordinates. The dog, a highly trained German shepherd, didn't bark. It didn't whine. It simply sat down and stared at the rock, refusing to move. When the handler tried to pull the dog away, it began to shiver with such intensity that it suffered a localized seizure. The vet later found that the dog's inner ear had been damaged by a high-frequency vibration, the same frequency reported by the 2009 climbers. The mountains don't explain why they choose to scream in a register, only the animals and the dying can hear. They only leave us with a dog that never barked again. We are the investigators of a cold case that refuses to stay cold. We look at the forensic images of the notebook and see that the ink isn't just ink. It is a polymer-based fluid that matches the coating on the internal circuitry of his satellite phone. He didn't have a pen. He had disassembled his electronics and used the components to write his final message. The preparedness of the man allowed him to improvise a legacy out of his own tools. He was a guide until the very end, marking the trail for those who would come looking for the why. But the why is a jagged peak that no one has yet summited. We are left with the how. How did he survive for 6 years? How did he move through the diorite? The reconstruction suggests that the 2003 tremor wasn't a settling glacier, but an opening. A doorway in the geometry of the Cascades that only stays unlocked for a heartbeat. Elias Thorne happened to be standing in the threshold. He didn't fall into a crevasse. He fell into the foundation of the world. And the foundation is made of more than just stone. It is made of time, stretched and folded like the leather of his notebook. No signal, no trace, just the patient, rhythmic pulse of the mountain. The forensic reconstruction now turns to the second year of the void, 2004. While the world had moved on, the grieving investigator stayed rooted in the data. In July of that year, a high-altitude weather balloon over the Cascades captured a series of erratic images. Most were discarded as motion blur, but frame 882 showed a distortion in the light above Forbidden Peak. It was a gravitational lens, a warping of the background stars and the horizon line as if a massive invisible weight were suspended in the air. This metadata suggests that the site of Elias Thorne's disappearance remained active, a wound in the sky that refused to scab over. At 3:19 a.m. on the anniversary of the event, sensors at the University of Washington recorded an infrasonic hum emanating from the coordinates Elias had texted. It was a sound below the threshold of human hearing, a rhythmic, low-frequency oscillation that lasted for precisely 6 minutes. When converted into a visual waveform, the sound looks like a heartbeat, a slow, steady, lithic pulse. The mountains don't explain why they choose to breathe, but they do so with a terrifying regularity. Imagine you are the ranger who had to tell Elias's wife that the search was being downgraded to a recovery effort. You are a man of the forest, accustomed to the cycle of life and death, but this feels different. There is no closure because there is no remains. In the absence of a body, the mind builds a cathedral of what-ifs. The forensic image of the 2009 discovery site shows that the grass beneath the gear pile was not crushed. In a typical missing persons case, the items are scattered by scavengers or buried by the wind. Here, the items were placed with surgical precision. Item 8. A silver compass, its needle no longer pointing north but spinning in a slow, clockwise circle at a rate of 1 revolution per minute. It was as if the magnetic field of the area had been replaced by a local, artificial one. Why would the mountain rewrite the laws of magnetism? Perhaps because north is a direction that only matters if you are moving across the surface, not through it. The rule of irony manifests here in the compass itself. The tool Elias used to navigate the world was now a clock measuring a different kind of time. The evidence log continues to strip away the comfort of the known. Item 9. A small vial of water found in the side pocket of the pack. When analyzed, the isotopic signature of the oxygen did not match the rainwater or the glacial runoff of the Pacific Northwest. It matched the water found in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, miles beneath the ocean floor. The technical term is primordial water, trapped in the Earth's crust for billions of years. To find it in a hiker's bottle at 9,000 feet is a forensic impossibility. It suggests that wherever Elias went, the geography was fluid. He was moving through a subterranean plumbing system that defies our maps. We are forced to look at the macro shots of the water's surface, seeing the way it refuses to ripple even when the wind catches it. It has a higher density, a higher purpose. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in 2005, a hiker on a nearby ridge reported seeing a column of cold light rising from the forbidden peak. It didn't illuminate the trees, it seemed to darken them, casting shadows that pointed toward the source rather than away from it. This is the iterative forensic reveal, the slow realization that the disappearance wasn't a moment but a process. Elias was being dismantled and reassembled by the terrain. The reconstruction focuses on the expert victim as a biological specimen. Elias Thorne had a resting heart rate of 48 beats per minute. He was a machine of efficiency. In the journals he left at home, he obsessed over the concept of the thin places, areas where the barrier between the observer and the observed becomes translucent. He wasn't a mystic, but he was a man who had spent enough time in the silence to know that the silence has a texture. He wrote, "The granite isn't just rock, it's a recording medium. It remembers the weight of the ice. It remembers the heat of the core. Sometimes it replays the tape." This indirect dialogue, pulled from a mundane notebook in his study, provides the only motive we have for his final route. He wasn't trying to summit a peak, he was trying to enter the recording. He wanted to see the tape. We look at the open-loop question of his intent. Did he know the door would close behind him? The 2009 discovery of the notebook with the final route drawn is the physical evidence of his success. The drawing is a map of the tape. It shows the mountain not as a solid object, but as a series of interlocking chambers, a geometric hive. At 7:02 a.m. on the day the notebook was found, the temperature at the site was recorded as a perfect 32 degrees, the exact freezing point of water. It stayed at that temperature for the entire duration of the discovery, regardless of the sun's position. The mountain was maintaining a laboratory environment for the evidence. We use flashbulb transitions to show the hikers' faces as they realize the notebook is dry, They are touching an object that shouldn't exist in our timeline. The forensic casual language of the official report calls it environmental shielding, but the grieving investigator knows it is a message. It is the mountain's way of saying, here is what remains of the man who dared to look. The narrative mimics the passage of time as we move into the third year of the void, 2006. This was the year the ghost pings started. For 3 days in October, the defunct satellite phone of Elias Thorne began to transmit metadata packets to a weather satellite. The packets contained no location data, only a series of timestamps from the future. Dates in 2012, 2018, 2024. It was as if the phone were being used as a ledger by someone who no longer understood the linear nature of our seconds. No signal, no trace, just a chronological scramble. The mountains don't explain why they choose to break the clock. They only show us the broken gears. Imagine you are the forensic tech who had to analyze those packets. You see your own death date in the string of numbers sent by a dead man's phone. You realize that the expert victim has become the expert witness. He is seeing the end of the story before we have even reached the middle. The moral warning is clear. Some maps are not meant to be read by those who intend to return. The mountain keeps its secrets, and it keeps its guides. We are left with the static-filled archival footage of the 2003 search, seeing the young Elias Thorne waving at the camera, a man who believed he was in control. We compare this to the macro shots of the rust on his carabiner found 6 years later. The metal is pitted and scarred, not by weather but by molecular fatigue, a condition where the atoms themselves lose their bond. It is the signature of a man who was stretched across the threshold of the impossible. Why would he stay? Perhaps because once you have seen the inside of the mountain, the outside feels like a shadow. The reconstruction is a slow burn of dread, a realization that Elias Thorne didn't vanish. He was archived. The final phase of the reconstruction, the narrative truth, settles into the heavy silence of the year 2009 and beyond. After the notebook was recovered, the grieving investigator turned their attention to the last few pages, which had been previously overlooked due to what appeared to be blank parchment. Under ultraviolet light, a different story emerged. The expert victim had not just drawn a map, he had written a series of observations on the nature of the inside. Elias Thorne described the interior of the Forbidden Peak not as a cave, but as a non-Euclidean resonance chamber. He wrote, "The stone here is not cold, it is a processor. It is calculating the weight of the snow above and the pressure of the mantle below. I am no longer a guest, I am a variable in the equation." This is the point where the atmospheric mystery reaches its terminal velocity. Elias was documenting his own integration into the geological record. The mountains don't explain why they require a human consciousness to function as a witness, but the evidence suggests that Elias was the latest in a long silent lineage. At 4:12 p.m. on the day the investigation was officially shuttered in 2011, a final piece of evidence was found by a glaciologist 3 miles from the original site. Item 10, a single silver filling from a human tooth resting on top of a fresh snowbank. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Elias Thorne. There was no bone, no blood, no signs of trauma. It was as if the mountain had finished its processing of the biological material and had spit out the only part it couldn't assimilate, the artificial. This fragmented emphasis, the metal, the stone, the void, builds a picture of a man who was literally unmade. Imagine you are sitting in the evidence room holding that small piece of silver. You realize that the expert victim was stripped down to his fundamental elements. The rule of irony is completed here. The very things that make us human, our tools, our memories, our technology, are the things the mountain rejects. The rest of him, the organic and the spiritual, has become part of the granite. The forensic casual conclusion of the state report lists the cause of death as undetermined, presumed accidental, but the storyteller knows this is a lie of convenience. There was no accident. There was an invitation. We look at the macro shots of the silver filling and see the microscopic scratches of a man who spent his final moments grinding his teeth in a state of absolute reverent awe. The open-loop question remains, If Elias is the mountain, who is watching us from the ridgeline now? The 2009 climbers still refuse to return to the Cascades. They speak of a harmonic resonance that they can still feel in their teeth whenever a storm rolls in from the Pacific. They are the living evidence of the event's reach. We used static-filled archival footage of the 2003 search one last time, focusing on the moment the cameras were turned off. There is a frame just before the black where the mountain seems to ripple. It is a visual cue of the ghost heat, a final flashbulb transition between the world we know and the one Elias Thorne entered. The mountains keep their secrets, but they do so with a cold, analytical precision that mimics our own. We are the investigators, and we have reached the end of the data. At 12:01 a.m. on the 10th anniversary of the discovery, a new signal was detected by a private radio array in the valley. It was a burst of metadata, encrypted in a way that modern computers cannot break. But the header of the packet was clear. It was Elias Thorne's employee ID number from the guiding company. The message was sent from a depth of 12 miles beneath the crust. The reconstruction is complete, yet the tragedy remains open. We are left with a moral warning. To be prepared is to be visible. To be an expert is to be a candidate. The mountain does not hunt the weak. It harvests the capable. It waits for the one who knows the route, the one who carries the notebook, the one who is ready to be invited inside. As the screen fades to a macro shot of moss growing over a rusted carabiner, the rhythmic echo of the wind sounds like a name being spoken in a language of friction and pressure. Elias, Elias, Elias. No signal, no trace. Just the long, slow burn of a memory that has become a part of the landscape. The mountains don't explain why, they simply remain. And we, the chroniclers of the tragedy, are left to obsess over the granular details of our own insignificance. The investigation is over. The vigil continues.